FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. It's November 7th, 2017. This year is going to be over before you know it. What have you done with yourself this year? What has been the best point of the year for you? Was this a great year? I hope it was. Housekeeping matters. Get involved in the show. Join us. Send us your email, kl@kerrylutz.com. Don't forget the Twitter feed @KerryLutz. So just finished a really entertaining but disturbing book. And it just so happens that you, Danielle, have written an article about it by John Grisham, a guy who I read his books or listen to them. He's a bit formulaic. He's a bit tedious, and he's always like a typical trial lawyer. It's always the insurance companies are evil. Everybody's evil. But in this case, he has identified an evil that Danielle, you know quite a bit about, and that is private law schools in the United States. Danielle, welcome back.
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, private schools of any kind and the, vulnerability of young people and those looking for advice on what to do with their life. I think that is a main theme, whether we see it in the financial realm, whether we see it in education consultation. I say it's just as vulnerable an area as medical consultation. And people, unfortunately, are very rarely dealing with a fiduciary that's required to put their best interests first. And so, some really horror stories have been going on, Kerry. And, in the end, we all pay because it just ends up being, more either superfluous debt in the system, untrained people for the wrong jobs who can't come into the workforce and pay taxes, wasted resources, buildings and malinvestment and things that ultimately don't add anything. Top-heavy structures that, siphon out funds to a few people and leave everybody, not only financially worse off, but in many cases, not even educated. So, as Gary Schilling loves to say, smart people go to universities and higher education, but it doesn't make you necessarily smart to go there. But at the same time, people have to learn something. And the other theme here, which reminded me of that book, in the old days, I even remember one of my family friends who became a judge when I was a kid, and he had gone to school by working for a law firm, right? They basically were trained to be a lawyer through an articling process with a law firm, and they only wrote their final bar exams at the end. There was none of this 3-year program of education and university and all the costs involved. So I think there's a theme here, which is that as companies have become less likely to train and invest in their workforce and in developing, whether it's in professions or other companies, developing their talent, as they become less inclined to do that, there's been this rise of the for-profit education model, and that has really, created a lot of problems.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Danielle. Education industrial complex is a big scam. Law school, arguably, maybe your first year you spend in the classroom, but then you should be learning it in a law office or clerking for a judge. There's no justification for 3 years of law school. Nobody's ever been able to explain it to me. I lived through it, and I remember orientation, a guy telling me who was in his senior year, he said, by the time you get to the middle of your second year, you'll see that hardly anybody shows up in class unless they're taking attendance. This whole accreditation concept. And look, the reason why you can no longer clerk in most states in the U.S., there's still a few that you can. I don't know them off the top of my head. There's a few that you can do it. The reason why is full employment for law school professors. It's to maximize the revenue from each law student. Because, look, just like you said, you used to clerk for a law firm for 5 or 7 years. You knew as much as just about any lawyer then. You're not expected to know everything as a lawyer. You know that. You're just expected to be able to know where to find it. And there's no justification for law school to be in a monopoly position to certify students as ready to take the bar. They've gotten that position and they're not letting it go. And Look, when I went to law school, my whole tuition, not including all the other stuff, was $13,500. That same education now is about $54,000 per year, which means by the time the kid is done in law school, he's $200,000 in debt. And that's what they keep talking about in the book, is they're tracking everybody's debt. And these kids, between the undergraduate debt and the graduate debt, they're going to be $250,000 in the hole by the time they're finished. And these private law schools, less than half the kids there pass the bar exam. And then the ones that do pass it have a really hard time finding any meaningful career path. So it's time to unravel the educational industrial complex, make it internet oriented. Let's make it low cost, get as many people into it as possible, let them benefit. And the ones that can't hack it, at least they haven't destroyed their financial future in the process.
Yeah, well, I think I was having an interesting discussion with a German couple that I met on the weekend, and their perspective on the immigrants that are coming into Europe and Germany was quite interesting, they were living it, firsthand. And one of the things that really struck me is there's a fundamental thing here which we must not overlook in all of our current issues and complexity. And it is that, for example, the world population has doubled in our lifetime. Okay, you and I's actually more than doubled. Yeah. It was about 3.5 billion people when I was born. It's 7.8 or something at the moment. This doubling of population has flooded into every aspect of human life. So whether it be an education system, which is overrun now with just more people, whether it's migrants moving around the world. My father was an immigrant from Ireland in 1958, back when the world population was less than 3 billion people. So, there's always been immigration. There's always been people fleeing war-torn areas or environmental problems in different areas and going out into the world. There's always been young people needing to train for work. There's always been workers needing to find jobs. But the problem is that now we've had so many more people, and at the same time, we've adopted these. It's I think in its core, there was some good intention in it, which was, how do we help people train? But mostly it was, there's so many people now and there's only so many jobs. So how do we, sort of sop them up, so to speak? Because they can't all come in and do internships where they learn everything, from the ground up. So let's sort of put them out to pasture, so to speak, send them off to be trained elsewhere. And then, we can sort of cherry pick from the options later on. And of course, at the same time, you had the rise of the social funding system, aka the taxpayer system, that said, "Hey, it's a good thing to allow people to borrow money for education. This is, quote, investing, right? Investing in education." Unfortunately, it wasn't actually an investment. What it was a debt creation machine, right? Because the investment was, let's loan money and collect the interest, and that'll be a source of revenue, both for the government and for the schools that then will have the benefit of all this cash flow coming in. So they became these legitimate massive business machines in their own right. And, again, the more we've added on zeros in the securitization of the last 30 years and the financialization of the last 30 years, the access to capital, the extension of lines of credit have just continued to go. And so, it's become as if that was always the case. Now, I actually think it's run its course, as these things do. I think that we've got to the end of where people can manage more debt. And so now everything becomes, how do we do this in a more efficient model? And at the same time, the more dollars that are flowing through a particular system, the more it is rife for, fraudsters and misappropriation and, losing track of what it was you were trying to do in the first place. So I think, again, there's been a lot of bad advice given to students. There's been a lot of neglect from businesses who are overwhelmed with, the workforce and the amount of options. The consolidation, the robotics uprising of the past, certainly of the past decade in particular, is making everything that they can do so much more with so much less. And that's not going to get better. That's going to get worse, right, Carrie? We by something like by 2060, they assume that, the world's computers will be AI intelligent, like as intelligent as humans. And between now and then, basically all our jobs are up for grabs, right? So what will we be training individuals for that is not going to become irrelevant in this future? One thing for sure, we have to figure out how to be a lot more efficient, how to have a better standard of living with wasting less. And that means cutting out a lot of this borrowing and extra interest costs. So, because you're already at zero rates. So it's not like you're going to make economies of scale by cutting rates further. Right now, people have got really cheap debt, but they're up to their eyebrows in it. So now we've got to figure out, with the influx of robotics and the population, which PS is going to grow some further from here, right? It's likely to go up to over 10 billion just in the next, 30 years. So the size of the population it's going to get worse. The number of jobs is going to shrink. So we're really at this tipping point, and I see it with young people. I feel my heart goes out to them. I've got 2 kids in university, was visiting there last week. They are fortunate enough to not have debt to fund their journey through this process. But a lot of the kids that they're with are just literally stressed completely out, like anxiety to the roof over the money they're having to borrow as they go, and what will they be able to do to pay enough, to get enough income to afford everything when they're done.
It's horrible. It's horrible. I know, I told my kids, sent them to college. I said, this is the best gift I'm giving you in the world. You don't even appreciate it now, but you're not going to have any debt when you graduate. And neither am I. I'm not going to be faced with, having to pay off what you should have paid off, where I'd be a guarantor of your debt. And, they learned really quickly when they saw everybody going to the financial aid office, but them. And unfortunately, it's all too rare. But there still are ways, we talked real quickly, and you've heard me say it before, community college. Start out for the first 2 years, have your kid take as many AP courses as they can in high school because they'll get college credit for it. When you go to community college, there's no limit to how many credits you can take there. And if you're going to go to a state college in the same state, they have to accept all the credits from the community college. So there are still clever ways to do it. And there, Danielle, some of these state colleges are extremely fine and near Ivy League caliber institutions. In fact, because of the squeeze and the money situation, they've become very exclusive. A lot of these, a lot of them. So it's just a question of really planning it out properly. I've had this idea for years, Danielle, of really counseling students on their debt and their considerations in taking on debt, in their goals for pretty much their careers, what courses they're going to take in college, how that's going to translate into economic opportunity, et cetera. So, there are things that can be done. You're not totally
and if you were, able to give that advice, which had nothing to do with being paid to direct them in certain directions, that's so critical because so many of the people that are in the front line in those positions are literally, being compensated to direct them in certain areas. And that's that conflict that, the odd individual can overcome conflicts of interest, but generally speaking, the average bear has to go with where they're getting paid. So this is the problem with all these models, whether it's being financial advice, whether it's career advice, like if it's driven by incentives to the person to direct the message, it's not going to be with that person's best interests at heart. The other thing that really strikes me as we're in a whole new dynamic. Like when we talk about not just has the world population more than doubled in my lifetime, but if the number, the amount of debt globally has, I wouldn't even know the multiple, but just for example, in the U.S. GDP to debt scenario since the Great Recession, since the last recession, U.S. debt to GDP for the government government was 63%. Today it's over 100%, right? God. Debt to tax revenue. So again, this goes back to just cash flow, right? Like, there's all these fancy ways to measure things, but I always say, what can the cash flow actually afford? Because that's really what people have to adjust their spending to at some point, or they end up going into debt, right? So debt to tax revenue in the US, you're almost at 1,000%. You're at about 979% debt. Government debt to tax revenue. That's second only to Japan, by the way, which is at more than 2,300% debt to tax revenue. Canada, for all of our little country, we are in the top 5. We're actually the 5th most indebted country at 695% national debt, government debt to revenue, to tax revenue. So here's the great equalizer in all this. There's only so much cash flow to fund anything and everything that people want. And daily life requires cash flow, right? So whether it is infrastructure investment, whether it is education, whether it is, whatever it is we want people to afford and consume, whatever the business models are, the reality is it's tethered to income. And so all the central banks of the world keep talking about their conundrum about why they haven't seen more inflation. The reason they mean in income. And the reasons are so clear, it's so obvious why they haven't seen increases in income, because of all the evolution to technology and robotics and the amazing amount of population that's spread through the world, and also the efficiency within corporation, the incentives for people to borrow and buy shares and increase efficiency of operations rather than expand the need for workers. I mean, there's so many things that go into this, but at the end of the day, all this phase is done, all the last 30 years is done, has below the price of assets, so that things are now unaffordable. It has done nothing to increase the general income flow or tax base. So, you guys are going through your big tax revisions down there, or the Trump proposal to, rework the tax code. That's only adding debt so far, right? If you look at it, it's adding debt. So again, until we figure out a way to get the income up and to stop wasting as much of the income as we have on superfluous things like interest payments that are basically non-productive, that's consumption you already had, we have to figure out a different model. And I mean on every single level, whether it's energy consumption, whether it's the food that we're eating, whether it's the houses we're living in. In Canada, as you know, we're in this epic housing bubble up here. And every day, I'm just looking at what's coming for the taxpayers, because so many of the mortgages, as you know, in the U.S., the same thing, were underwritten by, the taxpayers essentially for these high leveraged mortgages that people were reaching for housing that was insanely valued and continued to go up. And when they can't keep up with the payments, and that's just starting now, it all rolls back downhill. They just walk away from the asset. You get a bunch of empty houses. You get people going to a much more efficient place to live, whether it's a rental or combined family dwellings or whatever it is, because ultimately cash flow rules the day. And the other thing that the central banks have done with all this devastating policy is they've pushed rates, income yields that people could get off savings to nil. So that's only cut into cash flow as well. So it's quite simple when you pull back. You can see that we've been on this very misguided path, that the policies that have been driving the thing have been all about, increasing asset prices and prices without any commensurate increase in efficiency or incomes. So obviously we've come to that tipping point, and it's just now innovative models. We just need new innovative models that cut out all the middle people, that reduce all the superfluous cost, and that get much more efficient and much more targeted. So this general idea of training people for general, I think now is a luxury that many can't afford. And we need to go back to specific companies training people for jobs they need them to do.
Yeah, well, what happened is they've effectively outsourced all of the training aspects of business to secondary education, right? I mean, that's what's really happened. And I don't think it's been a good experiment. I think it's caused a lot of problems because these kids get out of college, and you can go to college and learn absolutely nothing for 4 years. I've seen people do it. So something's got to go. In any event, we got to go, Danielle. Find Danielle's work over at jugglingdynamite.com. And there's always a link to it in the show notes to this interview on Financial Survival Network. Again, become part part of the show, send us an email, kl@kerrylutz.com, Twitter feeds @KerryLutz, Facebook page, Financial Survival Network. Danielle, we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.